My name is Alan. I'm 47 years old, and I've spent the last 23 years of my life building a business, raising a family, and doing everything I could to make sure things stayed normal. Normal, as in steady, as in predictable, as in everyone gets what they need without too many complications. But that all changed in the span of one afternoon. It was a Saturday, and I had just left my office when I noticed Margaret's car parked outside Brianna's house. At first, I didn't think much of it. Margaret, my wife, always had some reason to be there, whether it was picking up Brianna's kids, running errands, or just spending some time with her daughter. But something about the way it sat there, too still, too quiet, hit me in a way that I couldn't shake off. I decided to pull over, not to confront anyone, but to just sit for a minute, watch. It wasn't like I didn't trust Margaret, but this feeling was gnawing at me, something in my gut telling me to be cautious. I parked a little down the street, far enough to not attract attention, but close enough to see. I watched her step out of the car and head toward the front door, but just as she reached it, Brianna's husband, Dan, came out, his arms wide open to greet her. They exchanged some words I couldn't make out, but the tone wasn't friendly, not like I'd expect from family. The smile on Margaret's face was too rehearsed, too fake. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about it felt wrong. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to see if I could catch any more details. That's when I heard them. The voices, coming from the backyard, just loud enough to reach me. "I just don't think Alan will go for it." Margaret's voice was crisp, calculating. "Don't worry about him," Dan responded, low and careful, like he was guarding a secret. "Once he signs the papers, it'll all be over. We'll have it set up with the lawyer, and once that's done, he won't be able to touch any of it." My stomach tightened. Sign the papers? What were they talking about? Divorce papers? I stayed in the car, listening, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The sound of their conversation was muffled, but the words were coming through clearly now. "We'll make sure he believes everything is fine," Margaret continued, her voice suddenly too smooth, too calm. "Just keep acting like everything's normal. He'll never suspect a thing." Dan laughed, but it wasn't genuine. "You always know how to play him." The weight of their words sank into me like a stone. My mind raced, my thoughts tangled. A plan, a scheme. It was happening right under my nose, and I had been too blind to see it. For years I had trusted Margaret. I thought we were a team, but now I was hearing it. My wife and son-in-law had been plotting against me, and I had no idea why. Or maybe, more terrifyingly, I hadn't wanted to know. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, but the shock of hearing them talk about manipulating me hit me like a freight train. I had always thought of our family as solid, unbreakable. We had our issues, sure, but who didn't? But this was betrayal, a deep, calculated betrayal. And what hit hardest was how easily they spoke about it, how comfortable they were knowing I was clueless. I didn't move at first. I couldn't. The anger was there, bubbling beneath the surface, but it wasn't enough yet. I needed to process what I had just learned. How far had this gone? How deep had their plans reached? But there was no time to waste. I had to act, and I had to do it fast. I reached into my glove compartment, grabbing my phone. Quietly, I switched on the voice recorder and aimed it toward the window. They were too far away to see me, too lost in their conversation to notice anything. I captured their plans, every detail, every word, just in case things went further than I could predict. By the time they came back into the house, I had enough. Enough to destroy their lies, their manipulations, their entire scheme. The next steps were clear now, but there was no turning back. The game had changed. As I drove home, my mind shifted from disbelief to a cold, strategic resolve. They thought they could use me. They thought I would play along, oblivious as ever. But now, I knew better. The fight had only just begun. The story begins here, with Alan's realization of the deep betrayal at play, his shock, and the first steps toward taking control of the situation. It will evolve as Alan goes from passive victim to a calculating strategist, prepared to outmaneuver those who thought they could destroy him. The tension in the air felt almost tangible when I walked into the house. Margaret was in the kitchen, her hands busy with something she didn't seem to care about, and Dan, as usual, was on the couch, flipping through some random magazine. They both looked up when I entered, the forced smiles on their faces feeling like a mask too tight to hold for long. I was careful, calm. I couldn't afford to let them see what I'd just overheard. It was better to let them think I had no idea. "Hey, Alan," Margaret said, her voice a little too chipper. "What's up?" I barely resisted the urge to laugh at her. "Not much. Just saw the car outside," I said, as casually as I could manage. "Brianna home?" "Yeah, she's upstairs, but I think she's going out soon," she replied, her tone still light. Too light. I nodded and glanced at Dan. He was sitting a little too still, trying to look like he hadn't just been part of a conversation that involved tearing me apart financially. I made sure to meet his eyes, my gaze steady, almost casual. "Dan," I said, casually leaning against the doorframe, "you two are organizing some kind of legal work, right? Looks like you've been pretty busy with all the paperwork lately." Dan blinked, visibly thrown off guard. Yeah, just some stuff for a client. Nothing big." I watched him closely. His jaw tightened slightly, and I saw a flash of something that made my blood run cold. Fear. He was lying, and I could feel it in the air between us. "A client, huh?" I said, my voice low, trying to sound disinterested. "What kind of work? You don't usually do that much legal stuff, do you?" Margaret turned toward us, a little too quickly. "It's nothing to worry about, Alan. We're just helping someone out. You know how it is, favors for family, right?" I could almost hear her forcing the words out, like she was rehearsing them for the millionth time. But there was something off in her tone, too smooth, too practiced. It made my suspicions grow even more. I was done playing their game, but I had to be careful. If they sensed even a hint of what I knew, it would all fall apart too soon. I needed more time to gather the pieces. I pushed myself away from the doorframe and smiled, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "So, just making sure I'm not missing anything here," I said, my tone suddenly lighter. "You're telling me this is all just for a client? And there's nothing else going on? No other plans? No big moves in the works?" Margaret stiffened, and for the first time, I saw her mask crack, if only for a split second. Her eyes flicked toward Dan, who had gone unnaturally still. My heart started to race. I was getting under their skin. "Alan, you're reading too much into this," Margaret said quickly, brushing past me to the sink, her back to me now. "Everything's fine. You don't need to worry." I felt Dan's eyes on me, but he didn't say a word. The silence between us was deafening. "You're right," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost lazy. "I shouldn't be worried. It's just strange, though, how you both have been so caught up in helping out that you never mentioned this client before, especially with everything else going on lately." I turned toward the door, as if nothing was wrong, even though everything was wrong. I paused halfway through the living room, letting the silence linger just a moment too long. "I'm sure it'll all work out," I said over my shoulder. "After all, family sticks together, right?" The words hung in the air like smoke, and I didn't wait for a response. I had already learned everything I needed to. Their uneasy glances, the defensiveness in Margaret's voice, the awkwardness between them, it was all too telling. But I wasn't done yet. As I left, I made sure to keep the same calm demeanor. But inside, my mind was already working, planning. They had slipped up. They thought they had me fooled, but I was no longer the clueless husband. I could see it now. They were setting the stage, trying to pull me into their game without my knowing. They had underestimated me, and I wasn't about to let it go that easily. As I walked to my car, my mind kept spinning. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. They hadn't expected me to question anything. They hadn't expected me to dig deeper. But now, I knew I had to gather the facts, piece by piece, and when the time was right, I would confront them both. I wasn't going to let them take my life from me. They had made a fatal mistake, and I would use that mistake to tear their plans apart. It had been a few days since my conversation with Margaret and Dan. Things at home felt unusually normal, too normal. Margaret was her usual self, trying to be overly pleasant, a little too sweet. Dan kept to himself, his nervous energy more obvious every time we crossed paths. I knew they were both waiting for something, maybe for me to confront them, or maybe for me to slip up, show my cards. But I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I didn't let my suspicions fester. I needed answers. Real answers. I spent the next few days diving deep into my financial records. I had a few rules when it came to my business and personal finances. Everything had to be transparent, balanced, and above board. For years, I trusted Margaret, trusted that she shared those same values. That trust was a mistake. I pulled up the records and started sifting through the transactions. Credit card statements, bank account reports, and tax returns. I scrolled through months of transactions that, on the surface, seemed innocent enough. But then something caught my eye, an unusual withdrawal, a large one. There it was, a substantial transfer to a new account, an account I had never seen before. I froze. I checked the dates. Margaret had set up the account with Dan weeks before I'd overheard their conversation. They had been planning this for a while. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was part of something bigger. I immediately reached for my phone. I had to talk to Marcus Webb, my accountant. He was the one person I trusted to dig through the numbers and find what wasn't immediately obvious. "Marcus, I need you to look into something," I said, my voice controlled despite the urgency in my chest. "I've found a new account that doesn't show up anywhere in the usual reports. Can you track it down and see where the money's been going?" Marcus, ever the professional, didn't ask questions. "I'll get on it right away, Alan. I'll call you in a few hours." I sat back, feeling a mix of disbelief and anger. I had spent years building my business, watching every penny, every move. And now, here I was, uncovering secrets that had been hidden in plain sight by the one person I trusted the most. A couple of hours later, Marcus called. His voice was calm, but I could hear the concern underneath. "Alan," he said, "I've found it. There are several large transfers to an offshore account, one that looks like it was set up a few months ago. But here's the kicker. Some of the money has been funneled into an account under Dan's name. This account, Alan, it's connected to a few high-risk investments, none of which you approved." I leaned forward, heart pounding. "So they've been siphoning off money. How much?" "A little over 100,000, Marcus replied. "It's all in chunks, but it's clear that it's not being used for anything legitimate. It's all been shuffled around, moved from one place to another." I could feel the weight of the truth settling in. $100,000. And it was just the beginning. How many other accounts were there? How much more had they hidden from me? "Thanks, Marcus. Keep digging, but don't go public with any of this yet," I said, trying to hold on to my composure. "I need to get ahead of this." I hung up, and the world seemed to fall silent around me. The realization of how long they had been plotting against me hit me all at once. For years, Margaret had played the part of the perfect wife. She had supported me, made me feel like the family we built together was a partnership. But it had all been a lie. She had been playing her part in a much darker plan. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the reports, the accounts, the numbers that told the story of betrayal. It wasn't just money. It was the years of my life that had been sacrificed, the trust I had given without question. It was everything. I started to make a plan. This wasn't going to be a fight where I reacted out of anger. No, I was going to outsmart them, and I would do it carefully. I began reviewing my assets, freezing joint accounts, making sure no more damage could be done before I could get the upper hand. The more I looked at the records, the clearer it became. This wasn't a quick scheme. Margaret and Dan had been planning this for months, maybe longer. They had laid the groundwork, just waiting for the right moment to strike. But they didn't know that I was already ahead of them. I felt a shift in myself. It wasn't just the hurt or the anger anymore. It was something cold, something calculated. I was no longer the devastated husband who had been blindsided by betrayal. I was a businessman, and I was about to take control of this situation. I thought about the years I had spent building my empire, about the sacrifices I had made, and the love I had given to my family. Margaret, Dan, they thought they could steal it all from me. But they hadn't counted on one thing. I had always been strategic. I was ready to fight back. It had been days since I discovered the full extent of Margaret and Dan's plan to destroy me, and every second felt like a slow burn. The world around me had already started shifting, and I was no longer the man who had quietly gone about his business, believing in loyalty and family. No, now I was the strategist, the player in a game where I would control the moves. They didn't know it yet, but they had underestimated me. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, Frank Lawson. Frank had been handling my business and personal affairs for years, and his firm was one of the best in the city. I needed him to help me secure my assets before Margaret and Dan could do any more damage. I had already frozen the joint accounts, but I needed to take further steps to ensure that they couldn't move the money they had been siphoning off into their own accounts. "Frank, we need to get ahead of this," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "I need to freeze everything. The joint accounts, credit cards, everything. We can't afford to wait for them to make their next move." "I'll get it sorted," Frank responded without hesitation. "We'll start with the banks, and I'll notify the credit card companies. I've got a couple of moves in mind to secure everything." The conversation ended quickly, and I felt the first real sense of control I'd had since learning about the conspiracy. The financial damage had already been done, but now I could stop them from doing any more. I spent the rest of the day gathering documents, making sure all my bases were covered. I needed to protect everything I'd built. I couldn't just sit back and let them take it from me. As I went through my files, I couldn't help but reflect on the years of betrayal that had led up to this moment. Margaret had always been the perfect partner. At least, that's how she had portrayed herself. The loving wife, the devoted mother. She had played her role so well that I hadn't even questioned her actions. But now, everything was clear. Every time she asked for money, every time she manipulated me into making decisions I thought were in the best interest of the family, it had all been part of her plan. I shook the thoughts away. This wasn't the time for reflection. This was the time for action. I called a few close friends, people I trusted with my life. They needed to know what was going on, especially with Margaret and Dan scrambling to cover their tracks. I couldn't risk them turning the narrative against me. It wasn't just about protecting my finances anymore. It was about protecting my reputation. "Hey, I'm not going to get into all the details right now," I said to one of my oldest friends, Charlie. "But things have gotten complicated. I need you to hear it from me first. Don't listen to anything Margaret or Dan say about me. I'm handling it, but I just want to make sure you know where I stand." "Alan, whatever's going on, I'm with you," Charlie said, his voice steady. "Just let me know what you need. We've got your back." By the time I hung up, I felt a little lighter. The weight of what was happening was still there, but I was taking control. I was no longer a victim of their scheme. I was the one calling the shots. I spent the next few hours preparing for what was to come. I knew they would try to cover their tracks, that they would push their plan forward, but they hadn't accounted for one thing: me. As I sat there, watching the clock tick down to midnight, a sense of calm washed over me. The uncertainty that had plagued me for days was gone. I wasn't reacting to their moves anymore. I was setting the pace. I had the evidence. I had the strategy. And now, I was in control. The next morning, as I drove into the office, I couldn't help but feel the shift in the air. I was no longer the man I had been just days ago. The old Alan, the trusting husband, the blind fool. He was gone. In his place stood a man ready to fight back, to protect everything he had worked for. I knew the battle wasn't over yet. Margaret and Dan would come at me with everything they had, but they didn't know who they were up against. I had spent my life building an empire with nothing but hard work and careful planning. And now, it was time to show them how dangerous a man like me could be when he had nothing left to lose. Things had changed, and Brianna knew it. I could see it in her eyes whenever she came over. The smiles weren't as bright. The conversations weren't as natural. She'd always been perceptive, but now it was different. There was an unease in her that hadn't been there before. Margaret was doing her best to play the role of the victim, of course. She always knew how to manipulate a situation to her advantage. But Brianna was starting to notice the cracks in the story. I saw it the night Brianna came over for dinner. Margaret had been trying to act normal, asking Brianna how work was going, how her relationship was progressing. But her questions seemed forced, and her eyes kept darting to me, like she was trying to gauge how much I had told Brianna, how much she might already know. I didn't let on that I was watching them closely. But as the evening went on, I could tell Margaret was getting frustrated. Brianna was quiet, too quiet, and when she spoke, her words were measured, carefully chosen. Finally, after the meal, Brianna sat with me in the living room, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest of the chair. I could see her thoughts swirling behind her eyes, but she hadn't said anything about what had been happening. Not yet. "Dad," Brianna said softly, her voice a little unsure. "Is everything okay? I mean, with you and Mom." The question hit me like a punch to the gut, but I kept my face neutral. I wasn't going to let her see how much this had affected me, not yet. I had been so careful about keeping up appearances, but now it seemed like Brianna had been catching on. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I said, putting on the calmest tone I could muster. Why wouldn't it be? She met my eyes, and for a brief moment, I saw the skepticism there. "I don't know. It just seems like there's tension between you two. I can feel it, Dad." Her words stung. It wasn't the first time Brianna had sensed something was off, but it was the first time she had mentioned it so directly. She wasn't a child anymore, and she wasn't going to just ignore the problems that had been brewing under the surface. "I'm sure it's just a phase," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Sometimes things get tense, but we work through it." She didn't respond right away. She just nodded, but there was something in the way she looked at me that told me she wasn't convinced. Brianna wasn't naive. I had raised her to be sharp, to see things that others might miss. I knew she had been watching Margaret closely, too. For a few moments, we sat there in silence, the weight of her unspoken questions hanging between us. I had known this moment was coming. Brianna had always been perceptive, always in tune with what was happening around her. And now, she was beginning to notice things I hadn't wanted her to. I could feel the pressure building in my chest. If she asked me the right questions, I would have to tell her everything. And I wasn't sure how she'd react. Would she take Margaret's side? Would she believe me? Or would she find the truth so overwhelming that it would drive a wedge between us? Before I could respond, Brianna spoke again, her voice quieter this time. Is she okay? I wanted to tell her everything then. I wanted to confess how I had learned about Margaret and Dan's plans, how they had been plotting behind my back. But the words got caught in my throat. Brianna had always been the peacemaker, the one who believed in family no matter the cost. And I wasn't sure if telling her the truth would break her, or if it would drive her to stand by me. She's fine, I said, my voice more firm this time. She's just been a little stressed. You know how things can get sometimes. But Brianna wasn't buying it. She was looking at me with a mixture of concern and suspicion, her psychology training kicking in. Dad, I'm not stupid, she said, her voice steady but with a hint of frustration. I can see it in her eyes. I can feel the tension when I walk into the room. There's something you're not telling me. I hesitated. The last thing I wanted to do was drag Brianna into this mess, but I could see she wasn't going to let it go. She was too sharp, too smart for me to just brush it off. Brianna, there's a lot going on right now, I said, my voice quieter. But I promise you, I'm handling it. Just trust me, okay? Her brow furrowed, but she didn't argue. Okay, Dad, I trust you, she said, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. I knew it wasn't over. Brianna was already starting to piece things together. I didn't have much time before she started digging deeper, but I wasn't ready to confront her with the full truth. Not yet. Instead, I spent the next few days gathering more evidence, compiling everything I could find on the accounts, the withdrawals, and the financial damage that had been done. I knew I couldn't keep hiding things from Brianna forever, but I also knew I had to be careful. The last thing I wanted was for her to get caught in the crossfire between me and Margaret. But I was starting to see how this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about manipulation, betrayal, and power. And Brianna had become part of the equation, whether she knew it or not. The quiet before the storm was over. It was time to prepare for what came next. The tension in the house had been building for weeks. Every conversation with Margaret felt like walking a tightrope. Brianna, too, had started asking questions that made me uneasy, her sharp instincts cutting through the layers of deceit. It was only a matter of time before she figured out what I had uncovered. I had been preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it hit me all at once. Brianna had been more distant lately. She was quieter, more observant. Her silence spoke volumes. I couldn't keep hiding the truth from her, not when she was already starting to see the cracks. The truth, as much as it pained me to acknowledge it, was the only way forward. I waited for the right moment to confront her. It came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of peaceful day when everything felt like it was on the verge of shattering. Margaret had gone out for the day, and I knew Brianna would be home soon. It was now or never. When she walked through the door, I could tell something had shifted. She looked at me differently. Her eyes were wide, cautious, like she was trying to decide whether to trust what she already knew or whether to hold on to the version of reality Margaret had spun for her. "Dad," Brianna said softly, her voice betraying her nerves. "Can we talk?" I nodded, gesturing toward the living room. "Of course, sweetheart. Come sit down." She hesitated for a moment before following me. We sat across from each other, and I could feel the weight of the conversation pressing down between us. Brianna opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, I took a deep breath and reached into my jacket pocket. "Brianna," I began, my voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "There's something you need to hear. Something I should have told you sooner." I pulled out my phone and played the recording. The sound of Margaret and Dan's voices filled the room, and I saw Brianna's face tighten in disbelief as she heard the words that would change everything. "Just keep acting like everything is normal," Margaret's voice echoed through the speaker. "Once Alan signs the papers, it'll all be ours." Dan's voice followed, low and conspiratorial. "We'll make sure he believes it's for the best. It's the only way we get what we need. I watched Brianna's face as she listened, her eyes widening as the truth slowly sank in. Her lips parted in shock, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the gravity of the words. I could see the betrayal hit her, her mind working to put the pieces together, the trust she had in her mother beginning to crumble. When the recording finished, Brianna didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was no anger yet, just an overwhelming sadness. "Dad," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this was happening. Mom and Dan, they've been planning this for how long?" "Months," I said, my voice quieter now. "Maybe longer. They've been using you, Brianna, using all of us." She sat back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly as if she were trying to hold herself together. I can't believe this. How could they do this? How could Mom do this?" I watched her struggle with the weight of it all. I knew this wasn't just about the money for her. It was about trust. The trust she'd placed in her mother, in the family she thought she knew. "Brianna," I said, leaning forward, trying to reach her. "I know this is hard. I didn't want to drag you into this, but you have to know what they were doing. You have to know the truth. They were trying to tear everything apart, and I couldn't let that happen." She shook her head, her voice a little more steady now. "I don't know what to feel right now, Dad. I don't know if I should be angry with them or with myself for not seeing it. I trusted Mom. I trusted them both." I nodded slowly, understanding how overwhelming this must have been for her. "It's okay to be angry, Brianna. It's okay to feel betrayed. You should be angry. But you also need to know that you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here, and we're going to figure this out together." Her eyes softened, but there was still a distant look in them, like she was torn between her loyalty to her mother and the reality of what had just been exposed. After a moment of silence, she finally looked at me, her expression hardening with resolve. "I'm with you, Dad," she said, her voice firm, though her hands still shook slightly. "I can't just turn my back on you. I won't." My heart swelled with relief, but I knew it wasn't over. Brianna's support was vital, but there was more to this battle than just the truth. Margaret and Dan were still out there, still plotting, and now I had to prepare for the next step. "You're stronger than you think," I said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this, together." Brianna nodded, her face set in determination. "I just need some time to process all of this, but I'm with you, Dad. I'll help however I can." And in that moment, something changed between us. The weight of the truth had shattered the illusion of family, but in its place, something stronger was forming. Brianna was no longer just my daughter. She was my ally, and together we would take on whatever came next. The courtroom was quiet, an eerie calm before the storm I knew was coming. I had sat through the early stages of the trial without so much as flinching, but now, as the day of reckoning arrived, I could feel the tension building in my chest. Margaret and Dan were scrambling, throwing whatever they could at me in a desperate attempt to salvage their crumbling empire of lies. But it was too late. I had done everything right. I had prepared. I had the evidence, the phone recording, the financial documents, the offshore accounts, everything. Margaret had tried to play the victim in front of the judge, crying about emotional abuse, accusing me of using my wealth to control her. But the moment my legal team started presenting the facts, her accusations crumbled. The audio tape played in the courtroom, clear and damning, as Margaret and Dan discussed their plan to tear me apart. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Margaret's face went pale, her lips trembling as she tried to hold on to the facade. Dan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sense of dread that seemed to grow with every word spoken by the attorneys. "I don't think we've ever seen a case like this before," the judge commented, his voice cold as the tape finished. "It seems that the defendant was not the one manipulating anyone here." Margaret's lawyer, who had been so confident just hours before, seemed to shrink in his chair. He tried to salvage her story, but the truth was undeniable. The judge had already seen enough, and the final blow came when Marcus, my accountant, took the stand, calmly laying out the financial details of their theft. The withdrawals, the transfers, the accounts, they couldn't hide it anymore. Dan's professional life was dismantling before his eyes. My legal team had discovered his shady practices, including the illegal manipulation of financial accounts for personal gain. His role in Margaret's scheme was more than just an accessory. It was active participation in the fraud, which made him just as guilty as she was. As the judge read through his professional violations, Dan's face flushed with humiliation. By the end of the day, everything had changed. Margaret, once the woman I thought I could trust, was exposed for the manipulative fraudster she had become. Dan, her partner in crime, was facing the consequences of his unethical behavior. His career was in ruins, his reputation shattered. Margaret's lies had been exposed in front of everyone, and the financial abuse she had subjected me to was now on public record. As the court proceedings wrapped up, I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, trying to keep my emotions in check. It was a victory, yes, but it felt hollow. The cost of this battle had been immense. Years of my life spent trusting the wrong people, sacrificing for a family that never truly appreciated me. Brianna sat beside me, her hand on mine, a quiet symbol of her support. She had stood by me through it all, and for that, I was grateful. But the truth, the bitter truth, had shattered so much of what I had once believed about love and loyalty. After the judge's final verdict, Margaret's world crumbled. The restraining orders she tried to file against me were dismissed. The divorce she had planned on securing with the help of Dan fell apart in front of her eyes. She tried to speak, to make one last attempt at controlling the narrative, but the words wouldn't come. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people looked at her, some in shock, others in disbelief. She was no longer the woman they had all admired. She was a liar, a manipulator, exposed for the world to see. Brianna, who had sat quietly through the whole ordeal, finally spoke up. She turned to me, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You did the right thing, Dad. I'm proud of you." I nodded, the weight of it all still heavy on my chest. I was proud of myself too, but it was hard to feel anything more than a sense of relief. The battle was over, but the scars it left would remain. Margaret's downfall didn't stop there. Outside the courtroom, I watched as she was engulfed by the whispers of friends and family, people who once looked up to her. I could see the judgment in their eyes, the way they turned their backs on her, and I felt nothing. No sympathy, no regret. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. Dan, on the other hand, didn't have the luxury of facing the consequences quietly. His professional reputation was shot. His once promising career as a lawyer was now in tatters. I didn't feel any satisfaction from watching his downfall. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about reclaiming what had been stolen from me. But it was impossible to ignore the bitter irony that the man who had been so smug in his manipulation of my life was now facing his own ruin. As we left the courthouse, Brianna walked beside me, her hand still on mine. She had been my rock through all of this, and I could see how much this had affected her. She had lost a mother who had been her role model, the woman she had trusted. But now, Brianna had a clearer understanding of the truth, and as painful as it was a step toward healing. Margaret would have to face the consequences of her actions. Dan would never practice law again. And I would rebuild. My reputation, though tainted by the betrayal, would be restored. People who had once doubted me were starting to see the truth, and I could feel their support growing. But as I looked at Brianna, I realized that while the legal battle was over, the emotional battle would continue. The road to healing would be long, but with her by my side, I felt ready to face it. The weeks following the court battle were a blur. As much as I'd won, really won, the victory felt emptier than I imagined. The tension in my house had faded, but so had the trust. It wasn't just the financial fallout that weighed on me, but the emotional toll. I had rebuilt my life from scratch once before, but this felt different. This wasn't about business deals or expansion. It was about rebuilding my soul. Margaret's downfall was swift and absolute. The moment the court dismissed her claims and Dan faced the consequences of his fraudulent behavior, everything started to unravel. She was left with nothing. The truth about her manipulation, her schemes, and her lies had been laid bare in front of a room full of people who had once admired her, and now, she was socially isolated. The friends who once praised her quietly started to distance themselves. Even family turned away from her. Margaret's former lifestyle, once fueled by the wealth I provided, was shattered. She was forced to look for a new job, a menial one, something she had never had to do in years. I had no idea where she ended up, but I heard through the grapevine that she was working in a small retail shop. It felt strangely satisfying to know that she would now face the struggles she had forced me to go through. Dan's professional life had fallen apart even faster. As soon as the disbarment proceedings began, it was clear that his career as a lawyer was over. His reputation was irrevocably damaged, and the financial mismanagement tied to his actions led to his professional ruin. Even if he wanted to salvage his career, the damage was done. No law firm would touch him, and his clients had already abandoned him in droves. I had to remind myself that none of this was personal. This wasn't about revenge, but it was hard not to feel the sting of their betrayal as their lives spiraled downward. They'd put so much effort into destroying me, and in the end, it was their own doing that destroyed them. As for Brianna, she had changed too. I had never realized how deeply she had been affected by everything that had happened. It wasn't just the shock of finding out about Margaret's betrayal. It was the years of tension that had existed beneath the surface of our family. The manipulation Margaret had carried out wasn't just financial, it was emotional too. Brianna had been manipulated into believing everything was fine, and it took a heavy toll on her. She had always been perceptive, and as she processed everything, she started to see just how much of her life had been based on lies. It was a harsh awakening for her, but I was proud of how she handled it. Brianna and I spent a lot of time together after the court case. We talked more, we spent more time in silence, and we began to rebuild our relationship. There were still moments of tension, of course, but with time, it became clearer that the bond we shared was stronger than ever. And then, there was my business. People had always seen me as the successful businessman, the guy who built everything from the ground up. But after the scandal with Margaret and Dan, I was unsure whether that reputation would hold. I didn't want to be defined by the betrayal, but rather by my own strength and resilience. To my surprise, the opposite happened. As word of the legal battle and the truth of the situation spread, people started reaching out to me. New business opportunities came my way, and my professional reputation began to heal. The community saw me for who I was, not the victim, but the survivor. I had faced betrayal, and I had come out the other side even stronger. Margaret and Dan were still left to pick up the pieces, and they would be doing so for a long time. Margaret's social circle shrank as people realized the extent of her manipulation, while Dan's legal troubles prevented him from ever working in law again. I didn't feel sorry for them. They had made their bed, and now they were forced to lie in it. As I walked through the halls of my office one morning, taking in the familiar sights of my team working hard, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. I had been shaken to my core, but it had led me to reclaim not just my assets, but my dignity and my purpose. The silence in my home now felt different. The empty spaces were filled not with the absence of betrayal, but with the quiet peace that comes from reclaiming oneself. I sat in my favorite chair, the one overlooking the city I had built, and for the first time in a long time, I felt calm. The battle was over, and I was free. I looked at the family photos on the wall, some of them before the storm, some after, and realized how much I had lost and gained in the process. There would always be a scar from the betrayal, but it was no longer the only thing defining me. What mattered now was the future, the new beginnings, and the lessons learned. I had taken back control. I had rebuilt. And most importantly, I had learned the difference between love and performance. The love that had once been disguised as devotion was nothing more than a performance to Margaret. But with Brianna by my side, I knew I had something real. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.